والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وثبت أقدامنا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا وقصورنا. اعمل معنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. ونصلي ونسلم على الدوام النبي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Very, very glad to be here. Alhamdulillah for the ni'mah. And inshallah, we ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to allow us to continue in our study of this text. It's a project that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And I apologize ahead of time for the delay. And we want to ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to aid us, and to guide us, and to allow us to bring out this knowledge from the ulama of Timbuktu, especially the knowledge of West African scholarship, that in specific of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi. We want to bring that to light so people can get a feel for what's going on. Let me share this. So let's continue, inshallah. So last time we were talking about the fact that the Sheikh, rahmatullahi alayhi, he separated between usul ad-din and ilm al-kalam. And we mentioned that that distinction is not a distinction which he himself generated, but is a distinction. It's a distinction which we find that the scholars of Islam, they engaged it earlier on in other texts that deal with the study of Islamic creed, in specific from the angle of the scholars of ilm al-kalam. The issue that comes up is that many times the term usul ad-din is used synonymously with ilm al-kalam. And that has its varying reasons. But there is a distinction between the two terms. And before going further, we wanted to define once again the terms usul ad-din and ilm al-kalam. Here, Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, on page 27 of the PDF, the actual page number is 27, states, as for the distinction between this science, meaning usul ad-din, or the study of what is foundational to believe in, as far as Islamic creed is concerned, that's a definition for usul ad-din. What's an obligation upon us to know, right? He says the distinction between usul ad-din and ilm al-kalam. What is ilm al-kalam? Ilm al-kalam is to take what's essential for us to believe, what's an obligation for us to believe. And this is why Sometimes you'll find that the term ilm al-kalam is used as an overlap with aqidah and usul al-din, although we should distinguish between these things. But usul al-din is that which is foundational, obligatory knowledge for us to have with regard to iman. When that's coupled with a set of rational proofs and teachings and arguments that argue against what's problematic belief, either from other sects or from different schools of philosophy, that's what's called ilm al-kalam. That's the distinction. That's the distinction between both of these sciences. There are some scholars who call usul al-din ilm al-kalam because the earliest issue that emerged from it was to talk about the Quran being the speech of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So the idea of kalam, it means speech, it means basically elaborating on a specific topic. That's within the context of the science itself, right? That's what's associated with the idea of kalam as a science. Then he says, realize that everything is not obligatory to know in terms of, realize that everything that is not obligatory to know in terms of the tenets of belief is not called usul ad-din, is not from the foundations of the religion. Rather, it is also included among the sciences of kalam. The early community and the later community, meaning the Salaf and the Khalaf, have agreed upon the obligation of learning usul ad-din. And then Shaykh Uthman bin Fodi, he says, as regarding ilm al-kalam, is considered to be from the collective obligations, from the fard al-kifayat. And we would actually say, in addition to that, that with regard to ilm al-kalam, there's differences among the ulama with regard to it being studied and taught. There is stages with regard to how it is that the scholars look at ilm al-kalam. There is a stage in Islamic history where kalam, ilm al-kalam, is in the minority, meaning the practitioners of it as far as scholars are concerned. And then there are stages in Islamic history where it gains dominance, and the approach, the Athari approach, or the approach of just focusing on what's essential to know from the Quran and the Sunnah was foundational without going into too many other details, that approach somewhat becomes marginalized. And the Kalam approach becomes an obligation upon people. That tendency was eventually rejected even amongst the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, because some people went to an excess where they started to say that if you didn't study Ilm al-Kalam, that your aqidah was void, that your belief was not sound and solid. You find that opinion that everyone, and the awwal al-wajib huwa an-nadhr, that the first obligation that people have is this point of dealing with rational proofs and argumentation in terms of understanding Islamic creed, in terms of supporting or explaining or clarifying what Islamic creed is. That internally amongst the Kalam scholars, especially finding Ashari text, uh, was a debated point with the majority opinion winning out that we don't invalidate a person's creed if they don't study ilm al-kalam. The important factor is for them to know uh, usul al-din. This is why we find this tendency to be up for debate amongst the people of knowledge. The other issue that comes in is that Imams like Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayh, he deviated from the approach of the people of Hadith, not in a bad way necessarily, meaning that he extensively studied philosophy and ilm al-kalam. He has a massive magnum opus, دار التعارض بين العقل والنقل, which is a book which seeks to deal with the issues that come up in reason and as they relate to Quran and Sunnah. And so there's a magnum opus. Magnum opus is multiple volumes. One of the best editions is by Dr. Muhammad Rashid Salim. Muhammad Rashid Salim. He's one of the top scholars in editing Imam Ibn Taymiyyah's books. He does a really good job, according to many of the scholars across the board. And so that's where you begin to see another type of approach. He was masterful in terms of hadith. Imam Qutlubuga al-Hanafi was a student of Hafid ibn Hajar. Hafid ibn Hajar, rahmatullahi alayhim jami'an. And he was a muhaddith to some extent, right? And so you find, I was looking at a text that he commented on by Imam al-Kamal. Imam Kamal al-Hammam. Imam Kamal al-Hammam, who was a top Hanafi scholar, one of their legendary scholars actually in usul and fiqh, and even he writes in aqidah issues in terms of ilm al-kalam. But you find that Qutlubuga, he is constantly referring to Quran and Sunnah. I believe the book is Masayira. And so you find the general tendency amongst the scholars of Kalam is not to be well grounded in hadith. You find some that are, in terms of their approach, and you find many that are not. They lean towards rational speculation. And so you find that within the science of Aqidah overall, you find this tendency of some scholars seeing the need to incline heavily towards hadith. The tendency of the earlier generations was not to delve into any philosophical arguments as they pertain to Aqidah. The need came about to engage due to changing times and ideas that were put forward in society. We see that problem today. The issue that we confront is that this realm of knowledge in which we talk about approaches to Aqidah, orientations, what is the function of Aqidah at a philosophical level, that's supposed to be initially the realm of, to use a contemporary term, experts. This is one of the reasons why Sheikh Mendan Fodi starts off with separating between very clearly Usul al-Din was foundational to know, was an obligation to know, in Ilm al-Kalam. Because Ilm al-Kalam is detailed issues. Ijtihadat. Ijtihadat meaning that their positions arrived at through research, consideration, discussion, furnishing evidences of a rational type, and clarifying one's thoughts and so on and so forth, and doing that with the utmost commitment to attempting to address the issues. And that's where we run into the whole discussion is that research rooted in the idea of certainty or not. And you have one camp that says that that is certain knowledge because it's based on rational proofs that are supposed to be impregnable, meaning unassailable, proofs that can't be undermined. And other people say no. When it comes to the issues of belief, uh, there's that which is foundational, and then there's that which is speculative. And it comes close to maybe certainty, but it's not going to arrive at certainty because our knowledge is limited. But what's foundational to believe is rooted in certainty, and revelation, and reason as well, in a way that detailed issues can't be supported. And the reality is that with changing times, the issues change as well. In today's time, we're arguing in society overall, Muslims and non-Muslims, but you find it heavily within non-Muslim circles, and it has impacted the Muslims living in the environment, and because the Muslim voice is very dim in the world as far as scholarship is concerned and impact on others. The issues are not shaped by the Muslim community, but what is a dominant issue is things like, is there truth at all? What is the basis of morality? And other issues come in like, uh, can we even substantiate the existence of God? Ilm al-Kalam was focused heavily. A lot of the arguments are repetitious over and over again. You find similar reality, that the arguments or the issues are repeated over and over again in Athari texts. There's consistency in the issues, so that if you study one text, you get a grasp of what's going on in another text and another text, and the only difference is nuances, terminology at times, certain types of discussions, added principles, maybe a little more depth, but the core issues remain the same. The core issues remain the same. But what you find in the issues of ilm al-kalam, people, and that's why, especially in this time, there's been so much debate in the realm of scholarship. What you find is that uh, many of the issues that are taken up at the core may not have relevance in the same way to today's time. Some of them may have relevance. So, a lot of what has been discussed in the Islamic scholarship with regard to ilm al-kalam, aside from the issue of its legitimacy as a science or its the permissibility to enter into it as a discipline, that's a very side issue at this point. When we talk about the actual practice of it, what we find that's done is that people are trying to figure out how to draw from Kalam research, from what has been said by the scholars, and they're trying to bring out principles and ideas and arguments in certain intellectual ways of seeing things, certain orientations, certain positions that have been taken, and see how it fits in today's time and how it speaks to the current day issues. Some have even argued for just like new methodologies. And so you have some people that have talked about new methodologies. If you look at the Yaqiniyat al Kubra by Al Bulti, and that actually the book is actually translated, uh, Universal Certainties. I know that I can't remember the exact translation title, but it's talked about universal certainties. And the book is translated by Mahdi Locke, and he spells it Mahdi, Mahdi Locke, Lock. It can be bought in Kindle form. So the introduction to Al Bulti's Universal Certainties, he lays down the methodology of Ilm al Kalam, and to be honest with you, he's bringing principles that are not really studied uh, amongst people. I know that one of my teachers, in response to the Salafi Dawah, he wrote a book called Ana Salafi. I'm sorry, Ana Ashari, because of the Ana Salafi, the I am Salafi orientation in Egypt, and the Salafi Dawah got really well in Egypt and other places at clarifying what its methodological approach was. So you find that this is something that is widespread. This discussion on what is the methodology for researching Aqidah, and um, how can we apply the methodology to today's time. You have others like Said Nursi, uh, who shifted and started inclining more to the Quran. You know, you had you had a shift in the past where people started inclining more to Hadith because they realized the ilm al-kalam went to an extreme, in its approach. In any event, Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, he clearly does not deal with the concept of usul al-din and ilm al-kalam as the two terms being synonymous. He distinguishes between the two, and he shows where it is that ilm al-kalam takes from usul al-din but adds on to it. And that, people, is extremely important. I mentioned this the last time we talked, the last episode. I mentioned it, and I think that, to be honest with you, is something that's necessary because we have to show the tiers of knowledge. We have to show the different disciplines. We have to show what the objectives are. We have to show what's essential for people to know. And people, it's not essential to get into detailed debates about Aqidah, to argue one school against another school. When people are not even familiar with foundational issues and how they relate to their lives, and there's no necessity for Muslims to be going back and forth on Aqidah issues as though we're engaged in an intellectual civil war. I wanted to say something and close out with this. Rajib al-Asfahani, sorry, Raghib al-Asfahani, uh, he said, with regard to Iman, something that's extremely important, and I believe this book is translated, Kitab al-Dhariya ila Makarim al-Sharia. I believe it is translated by Raghib al-Asfahani. Sorry, I had my Egyptian mind on, and they usually take the gene and they make it into a line, sound. So and then I was thinking about Imam Ibn Rajab, because last night I was looking at one of his books in Rahmatullahi alayhi, but it's Al-Raghib al-Isfahani, the famous scholar whose dictionary on the Quran, Al-Mufradat, is a book that is for the ulama. I've seen scholars rely upon it heavily because of the way that he traces Quranic terminology. Um, and he became known for that. And he didn't become known for other things. But anyway, he says regarding Iman fil Iman, he says, اختلف في الإيمان. Scholars differed with regard to defining Iman and understanding it. هل هو الاعتقاد والمجرد أم الاعتقاد والعمل معا؟ Is Iman الاعتقاد by itself? And الاعتقاد is that which you firmly hold to be true with certainty, no doubt, as a belief. Or is الاعتقاد والعمل معا? Is it that belief that you hold to be certain and true coupled with action? Then he says, واختلافهم بحسب اختلاف نظرهم. So he tries to identify what are the differences in terminology or terminological usage with regard to Iman, and why did the scholars differ? So you find, for instance, in the Aqidah of Imam Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani al-Maliki, who was known as al-Malik al-Saghir, in the beginning of al-Risala al-Maliki fiqh, Imam Abi Zayd was known as the younger Malik, the younger Imam Malik. In his famous primer on fiqh, he introduces it with a discussion on Aqidah. So he defines Iman being belief and action together, along with confession of that belief. Basically the shahada, that you testifying your belief, that you believe it in your heart, that you act upon it, and that you have the right intention to please Allah and to worship only Allah, and that your worship is aligned with the Sunnah. You have that, and then you have an Aqidah Tahawiyah. Imam Tahawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he was at one time a Shafi'i scholar and transferred to the Hanafi madhab. He was from the scholars in the Egyptian region, and he wrote his famous Aqidah Tahawiyah. He was a contemporary of Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ashari. Imam al-Tahawi became known for being a muhaddith. He has incredible books in hadith knowledge. He wrote he wrote in other areas too as well, in the Quran, fiqh, so on and so forth. He became famous for his hadith work. In Aqidah Tahawiyah, Iman is firm belief, and that's something that it became very popular opinion amongst the Maturidi school and the Ashari school. The scholars of hadith in general that lean away from ilm al-kalam, and the dominant position that they hold is that they define Iman to be coupled with action. Imam al-Bukhari, he says, Al-Iman qawl wa amal. The Iman is to testify La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah and to act upon it. That's a very brief definition. So Ragib, Raghib al-Asfahani, Raghib al-Asfahani, he's looking at those differences, and then he says that there are differences with regard to the defining of what Iman is according to the angle that they take, or the way of seeing that they have. I don't want to say perspective because I don't want to fall into uh, issues there with using that term, but the way that they see things. And seeing here means the intellectual take and what they understand. Now he goes into the actual cause of difference. He says, فَمَنْ قَالَ هُوَ الاتقاد والمجرد فنظر آه، فنظر منه إلى اشتقاق اللفظ وإلى أنه قد فصل بينهما في عامة فصل بينهما في عامة القرآن. So he says that group that says Iman is just firm belief in the heart with confession of it. It's not just a belief that's private in the heart, but is also made known. That they looked at the language, the Arabic language, in how it is that the root word of al-i'tiqad and its derivative i'tiqad, how it is that they generate a certain understanding. And it means tasdeeq in the Arabic language, to affirm. And there's other details. I don't want to go into those linguistic points, and I want to stay within a certain time frame as well. And that's not the purpose is not to go so deep here. But they look at the language and they stay with that, and then they also look at the fact that the Quran separates between firm belief and action, right? So he says, وقد فصل بينهما في عامة القرآن فعطف العمل عليه كقوله والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. Right. And so here the Quran says, and those who believe and they do good deeds. So the Quran made a distinction between belief and action. And then the other proof that they have is وَلِيَنَ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم فرق بينهما في خبر جبريل حين سأله عن الإسلام وعن الإيمان ففسر الأول بالأعمال والثاني بالاتقاد. And so he says that the Prophet also, they use that as a proof that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, distinguished between the two or separated the two in the hadith of Jibreel on the occasion in which Jibreel was asked, or he was asked about Islam and Iman. What is the difference between the two, right? So the first, Islam, was defined by action, the arkan of Iman, of the arkan of Islam, although we can say that it begins with the Shahada. But this is their logic. Their logic is to say that there is a distinction between action and uh, just reinforced belief or a strong affirmation in belief. And again, we can say that in Hadith Jibreel, the arkan of Islam begins with the Shahada and then the acting upon it. But that's not the route that they're taking. They're taking what is the dominant understanding of what the arkan of Islam are, and that is that majority four of those arkan, or four of those pillars, or four of those cornerstones of what constitutes Islam are action oriented. And so iman is defined purely in terms of affirmation of belief in the unseen, the arkan of iman. So that's the basis for the first camp, which defines iman as a strongly affirmed belief that we give testimony to, we verbalize, and action is not included in that definition. And then he says, وَمَنْ قَالَ هُوَ الْإِعْتِقَادُ وَالْعَمَلُ. So that camp that says that iman is certain belief, or belief that is imbued with certainty in action, they say that action is part of the definition of iman or acts because of the statement of the Prophet, الإيمان معرفة معرفة بالقلب وإقرار باللسان والعمل بالأركان. So here it says that iman is a comprehension of the heart. Some will use the term gnosis. We can say in simple terms knowledge, but that doesn't reach the total meaning of ma'rifa. Ma'rifa has to do with an intimate knowledge. So it is an intimate knowledge of the heart, is an affirmation or a testimony that's made with the tongue, and is acting upon the cornerstones of the deen. I'm sorry, is acting with the limbs. Here, the arkan, it means the limbs. It means that our bodies are involved in ibadah. So our heart, and that's in the spiritual sense, our tongue, meaning in the issue of testimony, uh, the declaration of faith, meaning that is made known, it's not hidden, and acting upon it. Sometimes they define al-amal bil arkan as acting upon the deen itself, but really is acting upon the deen not in the from the actions of the heart, but the actions of the body as well, like engaging salah, giving zakat, making hajj, that type of thing. And then they differed over the issue of whether iman increases and decreases. I don't want That's not our topic for the moment, but we wanted to deal with that issue of saying that the ulama, they differ over how iman is defined. It has some basis. Sheikh al-Albani rahmatullahi alayhi was of the opinion that that difference is not a semantic difference or a difference of angle or orientation towards the evidences. And many scholars differ with him on that. But in his explanation of Aqidah Tahawiyya, he said that this was a core difference because action is not included. Now, the only problem with that is the action is not included in the definition. The only problem with that is that uh, those who don't define action, those who don't define iman as part of it, including action, they still say that if we were to leave off actions, we're to get punished, and so we're obligated to act. And they're also we're obligated to act on the deen. We're obligated to perform our responsibilities towards Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We're encouraged to go beyond the basics. So it's not that they're leaving off action totally, it's that in the definition of Iman, they are defining Iman in such a way, like Sheikh Raghib al Asfahani mentioned, they're defining it in such a way as they find it in the text of the Quran. And in the Sunnah, they have their ankle on that. The other school, they have their ankle as well, and they have a set of proofs also from the Quran and the Sunnah to show that when you extend out the circle of evidences, you can find that the evidences speak to the issue of action being part of Iman. Then the difference comes in the reality of whether it is complementary to Iman or whether it's a core or cornerstone of Iman. And some of the scholars were careful in really dealing with that issue because if you define it as a cornerstone of Iman, when any of us fails in our practice of the deen, now we're closer to being outside of the circle of faith or the believers. And that's why the whole discussion came in, and you find it in Aqidah Tahawiyya, you find it in other texts. I can't remember if it's in Aqidah Wasatiyya. You find it in the books of Ilm al-Kalam from the Sunnis that the person murtakib al-kaba'ir, the person who's engaging in major sins is not a kafir. Because that discussion took place amongst the earlier generations. I'm not necessarily going to say totally in the time of the Sahaba, but it did begin somewhat there. Uh, and it became more and more clear what the discussion was about. The issue of a person committing major sins, taking them outside of Islam. So the Mu'tazila took a particular position along with the Shia, some groups of the Shia on that issue. And the Khawarij took a position. These are sects that were very clearly defined in the past. In today's time, some of them may exist, but like the Shia, but you're not going to find many people declaring to be Mu'tazili, and you're not going to find anyone claiming to be Khawarij, although there may be those tendencies that are present. But they engage in a discussion of what Iman is. And the reason why I bring that up is because uh, it's essential that when we talk about Iman, that we keep it at the basic level, that we keep it at the basic level. And when we talk about usul al-din, that we talk about that which is obligatory to know, that we don't go beyond the limit in that regard. And there's some things that we still need to cover, but I wanted to bring that up because when we go into the details, what ends up happening is that our foundation is not set correctly. And for all of us, what we need to do is focus on the basic foundation and practice and increase our knowledge in degrees and refine our character. Yeah, and those students and the students of knowledge, they're in a different realm of discussions, but they need to realize some discussions are not for the masses, and what's needed for the general public, those who are not going to be committed to study, because a person attending a class is not really committed to study. An example of being committed to study: attending a class, anybody can attend a class. Commitment to study means that you have a commitment to go through a process, through a curriculum over time. so that you get really rooted and grounded. So students of knowledge need to realize, mashayikh and imams, that yes, some people may be attending classes, but really where they're at in terms of interpersonal skills and where they're at with themselves spiritually, it may not be beneficial for us to open up the door to all kinds of ideas. Students that are in the university setting, studying other areas, they need to commit themselves to take time to study that which is going to allow them to survive in that environment and grow and flourish. And we had started a program like that in Chicago where we were trying to prepare college students for what they were going to encounter in the university. That's extremely important because there is a realm where there's a lot of deconstruction of the Muslim mind. There's and the Muslim mind, but before going there, is not really formed because people are not prepared. And that's why we say commitment to study is important because either way you can confuse people. You can confuse people, what when they don't have a real commitment to seeking knowledge, or when you're trying to prepare them properly. The Muslims need to have a commitment to knowledge overall. That's the issue here. And so I want to leave by saying Sheikh Uthman Danfodio wants us to progress, rahmatullahi alayhi, to the ladder of knowledge stage by stage. He wants to build a community. He wants teachers to know, don't mix levels of knowledge. Know what the people need, not what we think that they need, or not what we want them to need. Know what the people need. And what the people need is to make sure that they have a clear distinction between an academic study of Aqidah, which is dealing with intellectual problems and issues, and actual foundational Aqidah that they need for their Iman to be sound. And so when we start going into a lot of the details and we're arguing against this group and that group, many times people are focused on thinking that that is Aqidah, uh, in terms of their belief versus just knowing what's foundational and practicing that, which is foundational knowledge, not only in terms of belief but in terms of action, and then stabilizing that, and then coming up in their knowledge of creed to another level, so that their character is built. And one of the things that we're missing is a tight relationship with the Quran. We're focusing on all these side classes. Even that was the case when I was studying more in my younger years. We were deeply distracted from actually having a strong relationship with the Quran, because of studying this book and that book. And you can drown in this stuff. You can drown in this stuff. You can drown in uh, a book in study a book in Aqidah, 15, 20 lectures, 50 lectures, 150 lectures. You know, you can drown on this stuff for years and then never have a strong relationship with the Quran. And that's not the way of the ulama. The way of the ulama is that they were reciting Quran with frequency. That's something that we have to train ourselves to do, right? And they knew their ibadah really well. They knew the fiqh of ibadah really well, at least at the basic core level. And so that's what Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio is doing. He's giving us the evidences that we need to know for foundational knowledge. And it's not basic knowledge because he's dealing with evidences. They still have to be understood with detail, but these are the real cornerstones of knowledge, because you're talking about knowledge from the Quran and the Sunnah. You're not just talking about what scholars have said about this point and that point. He adds some of that as well, but he's giving us rootedness, groundedness, right? And he's doing it in the flow, in the style, in the orientation of a scholar who's Rabbani. A scholar who's Rabbani, what it means to be Rabbani is to know how to take a person from one stage of knowledge to the next according to their station and standing and understanding. Right? That's important. Where they're at. intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, deal with them where they're at, and then you raise them to the next level according to their need. And that's what Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi did. And so he separated, I want to leave with the lesson today. He separated between usul al-din and ilm al-kalam. And I mentioned that before. And he said ilm al-kalam is a collective obligation. It's not an individual obligation. In fact, even Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, he advised uh, for the general public not to enter into ilm al-kalam. And he just gave some general principles as to how it is that people should be dealing with knowledge. The scholars of hadith in Aqidah, many of them, Ahl al-Athar, that don't enter in ilm al-kalam, they also didn't want the people to enter into ilm al-kalam, at least at the basic level. Sheikh Muhammad did do mention the need for a contemporary scholar for ilm al-kalam, some issues you see. Uh, the same thing with Ibn Taymiyyah. He refers to ilm al-kalam on some tight issues, some theoretical, philosophical issues. But that, as I mentioned before, for people who are really committed to study, not for people that are taking knowledge as a toy or a game or a pastime or plaything, and then they lack manners and they use it for debate and they use it for canceling each other. They use it for takfir of each other. They use it for calling each other mubtada, and that's across the board. That's not just one group. That's not just the Salafis. It's not just the Asharis. If you go into the Deobandi camp and you go into the Brailavi camp, you see the same thing. You see across the board. Muslims have lost the sense of just having a basic regard and respect for one another. And we find reasons to cancel one another. And Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio, by giving us that distinction between usul al-din and ilm al-kalam and making sure that we understand, he didn't invent it. And I mentioned that before, but in the summary, I'm saying that he didn't invent it, but he clarified it for sure. Because in the books, when you go into the books and you see what some scholars say, and I've heard it from scholars myself, they say ilm al-kalam, usul al-din, aqidah, they put them all together. And Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio showed where it is that ilm al-kalam differs. Ilm al-kalam takes usul al-din, or what's foundational knowledge in the deen, adds on to it rational proofs and disputation with different groups on on issues that are not the core issues always, right? Are not the core issues. They're made into the core issues. And he says that that's a collective obligation. It's not an individual obligation, but what's individually considered to be an obligation or an obligation on the individual is to know the foundations of Iman. And so we'll finish covering chapter 3. Probably it's going to take about 2 more sessions or so, maybe even 3 sessions. And I'll try to keep them short, minimal, to maybe half an hour each. So maybe an hour and a half. And there he goes into, uh, he does something that's very necessary, is that he takes basic Ashari concepts, but he's calling on Quran and Sunnah, so it's palatable, is digestible for someone that is Salafi or Athari as well, because he's not going into anything that's extremely controversial or where there's a lot of differences of opinion. He's staying bare bones. He's staying bare bones uh, with regard to what's considered the usul of the deen, and he's more focused on just making sure that the student of knowledge knows what are some foundational principles from Quran and Sunnah with regard to belief. That's what makes the text very valuable. That it could be a text that's read by people of different orientations, right? And so we end on that note. We ask Allah Ta'ala to give us success in this world and in the hereafter. And as Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio said, "Tawfiq billah, success is with Allah." We ask Allah to forgive us our sins, to guide us, to aid us, to protect us, increase us in Iman, make us firm in Iman, allow us to die in the state of Islam, and open the gates of rizq for us in this world and hereafter. to accept from us all of our deeds, to forgive us of our shortcomings and our sins. We ask Allah to protect the generations that come after us, to establish them in Iman. And we ask for the dead, for those that have passed away. We ask for Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, rahmatullahi alayhi, and others. We ask that Allah forgive them their sins and allow us to benefit from their knowledge and them to benefit from their deeds that they left behind. And we ask Allah to appoint someone to pray for us after we die. We ask Allah wa ta'ala for all of the sick and for all of our brothers and sisters. That we ask that Allah put love and mercy between our hearts and to remove those obstacles for people that are having serious difficulties in their lives, for the economic, health wise, safety wise, or Iman wise. We ask Allah wa ta'ala to protect us and not allow us to have any fitna in our deen. And we ask Allah wa ta'ala to grant us strength and not to put something upon us which is beyond our means. And we send salawat on the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam.